Welcome to a reading of About That Wine I Gave You. This chapter is called Sign of the Swallows, and the song you're listening to right now is known as When the Swallows Come Back to Capistrano. So as the words go, when the swallows come back to Capistrano, that's the day you promised to come back to me. When you whispered farewell in Capistrano, 'twas the day the swallows flew out to sea. They recited the song's lyrics as fourth graders, without understanding the deeper meaning of loss. They say you can never go back home, but what happens when you return to the place you experienced the rush of first love? Where have all the swallows gone? Paul wondered. Long time a-passing, and began softly singing, Where have all the swallows gone? Long time ago, looking at the empty nest under the eaves of his house. Each year, Capistrano hosts the Fiesta de las Gorolindas, a week-long celebration of the swallows' auspicious return, culminated by the Swallows' Day Parade and street fair. Tradition has it, the main flock arrives March 19th each year, St. Joseph's Day, and flies south October 23rd. But since Paul was in middle school, the numbers dwindled to the point where few, if any birds at all, returned to the mission. Jane texted Paul. She was flying to Los Angeles on business. Would you like to meet? I guess she got over it, he thought, still pained by their disastrous last meeting. He texted, Down the rabbit hole or through the looking glass? Whichever you prefer. Miss you. I'll pick you up at the airport and transport you to another world. He considered several places, upscale Santa Monica, Malibu, or hip and edgy Venice, or there was the Perch in downtown LA, a hipster rooftop restaurant that offered a view of downtown at sunset. She could order a dry blush, minted in Provence, and he a bouillabaisse, and they could pretend to be in France at the Côte d'Azur watching all the beautiful people. That would be so Los Angeles. What about Disneyland, the Magic Kingdom? And then he was inspired. What if I take her to Capistrano? Could lightning strike twice? When Paul nicked himself shaving the day they were to meet, a messenger from Der Teufel appeared on his left shoulder and boomed in his ear. Don't you want her? Of course. Sign here, said the pint-sized devil, pulling a pen from his pointed ear and a contract longer than a bank's mortgage agreement. Is this a Faustian bargain? Didn't you read the fine print? I recall things didn't work out well for Dr. Faust. You're damned anyhow. Don't you want her? In exchange for what? In exchange for nothing. You think we forgot your misadventures? Your soul is already damned, and you're mine. You have nothing to lose. Besides, she wants you. She wants to jump down the hole with you and jump your bones. She's yours for the asking. There's no sin in it. She's not married, and you're already guilty of sin. How many times have you imagined being with her? Didn't Jesus say it's better to pull out your eye than look at another woman with lust in your heart? Why haven't you pulled out your eye? Stop all the imagining. Be a man. Take her. He pointed to the contract. Sign. A bead of blood dripped from Paul's nicked chin, forming a red X on the signature line. Just then, an angel appeared on his right shoulder, and the blood from his wound stopped flowing, and the red ink of the parchment disappeared. Paul, don't listen to him. Why not? Asked Paul. He's right. I'm damned. I might as well enjoy life while I can. The Lord will provide everything you need. The Lord is bullshit and doesn't exist, interjected the horned messenger. How can you say the Lord doesn't exist, but you exist? Paul asked the horny one. Don't you see all the pain and suffering in the world? Replied the little devil. The Lord will provide. Don't sign. Will you give me Jane? Paul asked the angel. You're surrounded by all the love you need, the angel replied. That's a vague answer. Fuck her, coaxed the little devil, and with that, Paul emerged from his reverie. wiped the blood off his face, dressed, and drove to meet the woman of his dreams. He picked her up in the early afternoon at Lax's Tom Bradley Terminal, and they sped south on the 405. The first thing Paul noticed, returning to the mission 40 years later, was a waist-high retaining wall running the length of the grounds, the same height as the Great Wall of Merle in his vineyard. This wasn't the original wall, but it was well made and attractive, finished with Santa Barbara-style stucco. Funny, I have no memory of this wall, but it's so similar to my wall. Did Paul admire this smooth finish because it made an impression on him as a child, or is the appreciation for smooth stucco innate, similar to what causes swallows to navigate thousands of miles over the ocean to a seaside town in Southern California? Paul disliked sprayed, coarse stucco used in California's cookie-cutter tract houses. He preferred the stucco that starts as Portland cement, that's smoothed with a hand trowel. Stuccoing a wall was as soothing as working with clay or the vines as he invited friends over to drink wine or beer and finish the wall, largely constructed by Rodrigo. The Mission's smooth stucco made an impression on Paul in his youth and was imprinted on his aesthetic DNA, as was the discovery of friars growing grapes. Jane and Paul entered the grounds and strolled along the pathways. He admired the abundance of American aloe that Sheila condemned as intrusive. Paul populated their property with drought-resistant native plants and succulents he observed throughout Capistrano's gardens. There was something about the mission that welcomed him. He was drawn towards a raised fountain filled with water lilies, reminding him of Hangzhou and the West Lake, and of his stroll with Jane when they made wishes before lily pads in a Central Park fountain. He plucked a spiked red orb from an outstretched, prickly arm, carefully peeled it, handing it to Jane, needle-free, she inhaling the aroma of strawberry cactus, savoring a sweetness just shy of grapes. He admired the hallways of brick and faded plaster, and with the perspective of middle age, wondered if the mission system was as beneficial as taught in school. Were native people mistreated? Well, all that was in the past. It wasn't his history, because he wasn't Spanish. He wasn't Mexican. He wasn't a native. His ancestors arrived from Europe, settled in the South, and eked out an existence until his father headed west. He wasn't responsible for colonization of Southwest native peoples, Indian reservations, nor enslavement of African Americans. What responsibility, if any, did he bear? What about the segregation of his father's Richmond neighborhood, which prevented black families from sharing capital gains of real estate appreciation in white neighborhoods? What about the repatriation of Mexicans during the Great Depression? That story was certainly not taught when he was in school, when so-called Mexicans, many American-born citizens, were made an offer they couldn't refuse to return home. Those were his people, Californians, making those demands. What about his mayor growing up, Pete Wilson, who, when he became California's governor, supported legislation to deny illegal immigrants health care and removed their children from schools Paul, Kate, and Alex attended? And now, his silence for not speaking out against the xenophobia of his day, when leaders of his adopted city rounded up illegal migrants, and right-wing politicians exhorted followers at rallies to send Mexicans back to Mexico. Where was Paul's voice? Maybe Jane was right. "I've been thinking," he said to her. "I owe you an apology. I told you I'm not my ancestors, but I realize I have part of the injustices they committed, just as now my silence contributes to mistreatment of migrants. This is the message Capistrano is telling me," he confided, under the statue of Father Sarah, comforting a native and looking down in judgment at Paul. Apology accepted. As they walked through the gardens, Paul taught Jane the names of the succulents, cacti, olives, and palms, all of which he planted among the rocky outcrops of his property. "This place is magical," Jane said, feeling her inner unicorn. "What makes you feel that way?" "Everything about it. The garden, the high walls, the blooms. Smell the blossoms of the orange trees. If I lived in California, I could step outside and make fresh squeezed orange juice every morning." They sat in a courtyard, surrounded by 200-year-old stone walls and 4 hanging bells, where Jane described the meals she would prepare, wine pairings, and scents she'd create inspired by the Southwest. Paul pointed up at the building they faced. "Look! Swallows!" "Oh my God! Look at the mark on her forehead. It's a miracle. They've been absent from Capistrano so many years. After Bluey died, there were dark days in our vineyard, and our swallows left. They must have flown here. It's a good sign. I hope they'll nest and invite their friends to join." Her meeting the next day was in Beverly Hills, and Paul drove her to her hotel, passing the time in the car with 2 hours of lively conversation. They always had something to talk about. At the hotel entrance, he opened her car door, gave her a warm embrace, and sent her on her way. A perfect gentleman, the good angel, having prevailed in the morning debate. On the drive home, Paul said a silent prayer for Alex and the troops as he passed Camp Pendleton and pulled over at the scenic overlook to stretch a few minutes. He took a deep breath of ocean air and texted, "Guess where I went today?" 30 seconds later, "The Mission." "Oh my God, can't believe you guessed right away. Yes, I was there, thinking about you all day. How are you?" They agreed to meet when she was in town in 2 weeks.